It's great to be back with everyone. And you know, I like to think that you're right, Shira. It's a little bit somber sometimes, the class. But nonetheless, I hope we have a thought-provoking good time thinking about these issues. I have been thinking of showing there's a famous clip of the movie The Princess Bride, in which they have the scene of being mostly dead. Is a good comic relief. So maybe I'll show that next time when we talk about active euthanasia, just to break it up a little bit. But there's no doubt, it is a little bit of serious topics, and the truth is, what came up a little bit in the Q&A last time is also that not only being interesting topics in theoretical level, but for many people, these are real topics that they're grappling with in one form or another. And certainly, already I had this ready for last week, but if you'd like to follow up privately with me about something from the issue, I'm always available. Shira, maybe we can put my email in the chat at some point, and but I'm always available to speak about that at your convenience, a separate time. Okay, so we're going to be speaking. Let me just pull up my second. Sorry. Okay, so we're going to be speaking today about passive euthanasia and dilemmas of withholding and withdrawing care. And just to make sure that we're on the same page in terms of whether you were here last week or not, you'll recall last week I spoke a bit about this notion of this debate that came up, particularly with Lord Jacobovitz and Sal, about whether Judaism has this concept of the sanctity of life to the extent where that is the dominating value and perspective that we take to issues of end-of-life care in particular, but many other issues as well. And what I try to argue is that Jewish law and Jewish ethics don't think about these issues in monolithic terms, right? It's not just a matter of one value, but rather there's going to be multiple values at stake, and then that's going to complicate things. If you just think there's one value that dominates, every moment of life is precious or of infinite value, right? You may remember that from last week. So a lot of these issues become much easier to think about and deal with. Meaning it's sort of a case of, well, basically keep people alive. That's the only value and goal that we have. And the opposite extreme, and we'll discuss this more a bit next week, there could also say, well, the only value is autonomy. Right? What do people want? People decide for themselves, right? So that's also in some ways a monolithic perspective. Obviously, in practice, people understand that it gets a little more complicated, but there is this trend in certain different circles of feeling that one value should dominate our thinking on these issues. And what I tried to show last week is that it's a lot more complicated than that. As we're going to continue to see that this week, we'll get to questions of passive euthanasia, so to speak. Euthanasia being a term referring to letting people die or mercifully, or well, we'll get into exactly what that looks like. And the passive part you'll have to define. But this is all in contrast to a notion of, let's say, active euthanasia, where you're actively going and doing something in order to let someone die or kill someone, depending on how you formulate it. And we'll talk about that more next week. So this week, we're going to be thinking about issues of passive euthanasia. And I want to start with a medieval source, which I think is particularly interesting. This actually is a source called Sefer Hasidim. Sefer Hasidim was compiled by a group of what are known as German pietists, a group of not Hasidim in the the modern sense, the way we think of it, right? But they're talking about people who had a certain pietistic view of Judaism, highly influenced by mystical thought as well. And as we're going to see, this book is undoubtedly the most influential book when it comes to Jewish law and end of life in precedents in interesting ways. Okay? And here's an important passage that doesn't always get cited, but should be well known. And Rabbi Chassid tells us as follows: we do not cry out for a moribund person. Okay, this in Hebrew, the term is goses. Goses is a difficult term to translate. It clearly means someone who's terminally ill and then some, right? It's not just terminally ill. There's a general sense thing that this is the end stage, but exactly how to define it is a matter of debate to the point where many folks just don't think we don't really know how to define this. We'll come back to this a little bit later on. So you have your goses, who's in the end stage of life. At the moment of the departing of the soul, do not cry out, lest his soul return, and he will then suffer affliction. He will suffer yisurim kashim. Meaning, Rabbi Yehuda Chassid is saying if someone's about to die, don't scream like, out and loudly, and they'll startle them, so to speak, right? It's not exactly clear what he has in mind, how practical this is, and when he's seeing this. But the general point is very clear, though. Don't stop someone from dying when all you're going to do is bring them back to a moment of suffering. Okay? And he quotes then the well-known pasuk in Kohelet, right? There's 8 lamut, right? Became famous from the song, right? To everything, turn, right? But here it is, there is a time to die. And so what is the meaning of this? It is to teach that when a person is moribund, the goses, and his soul is departing, we do not pray that his soul return to him, because he would in any event be able to live only a few more days, and those days would be in pain. And this is a very important principle being established already in the medieval time period, 12th century, which is saying there's no point in prolonged dying. Right? You have a person who's a goses, they're in the process of dying. Do not prolong their dying, because all you're doing is keeping them in this world of great pain. Right? Now, this notion, I think, takes on an interesting manifestation in the 20th century. And this is really a great refutation of the idea of Rabbi Jacobovitz last week. And it was given by none other than the Steipler Gaon. Steipler Gaon is a, very, very famous, significant Gadol b'Torah in Bnei Brak. And he wrote a letter, and for many years, no one knew who the letter was written to. It's actually super cool, but it's a letter in the 70s. And last year, you might remember that Rabbi Dr. Abram Chorsky passed away. Sort of a well-known figure, a very interesting figure. And a little bit afterwards, actually a friend of mine, I think he's taught for Torah in Motion a few times, Rabbi Professor Eddie Reichman was reading his book, one of his earlier rabbinic books on this, and he discovered that the famous letter that we're going to see right now of the Steipler was actually written to Rabbi Abram Chorsky. And Rabbi Chorsky's father, who knew Steipler, that family, went back to Europe. So he was apparently sick, and he'd asked the Steipler, can I give my father necessary injections myself? And is a son allowed to do that for the father? It seems that by the time he got to writing the answer, the father had passed away. But we now know that this was written to the Steipler. This is written to Rabbi Chorsky. We see this in Rabbi Chorsky's book. And this is a super important statement. Okay? You see, this is the version of Rabbi Chorsky's book. This is the version of Rabbi Kanievsky's book. It's called a sefer called Karyana Ligarta. Okay? And here I'm going to read a translation of it, which is very significant. Concerning the principle, meaning he had heard this idea that whatever one can do to prolong a person's life, even only for Chayei Shah, it should be done. Right? There's this notion out there that Judaism believes that no matter what we prolong a person's life, it should be done. And he says as follows, in truth, I too heard in my youth the aforementioned idea, and I did not know if it comes from a reliable source. In my eyes, this matter requires intensive investigation. For in Yoreh De'ah, we're going to see this coming up in the Shulchan Aruch. It is clearly stated that it's permissible for one to remove an impediment to a suffering person's death, if this will prevent severe suffering, as long as one does not move or touch the dying person himself. Meaning, in Shulchan Aruch, it tells us that remove impediments, let the person die, because they're going to be suffering. Therefore, with regard to taking a passive stance, I do not see a prohibition. On the contrary, there is a source in which you can drive that is correct to refrain in this situation, refrain from keeping a person alive. We'll see the source coming up. And he goes and says, although one could say that a ghost is different, is already in the process of dying, nevertheless, it would seem that as long as the treatment will lead only to Chayei Shah, temporary life, and cannot really save his life, the situation is analogous to the goses, where the goses is nonetheless considered alive in respect to all matters. So here you have the Stipler Gaon, this very, very famous rabbi from Bnei, who's basically pretty clearly asserting this notion of saying that every moment of life is of infinite value, and therefore we should keep people alive, always prolong life, is not true. It's just not true. Right? And it's just, and this is something which I can't stress enough, right? Because there is this idea that's out there, and here's the Stipler Gaon, right? Who's telling us this? And as Rav Weiss from the Important Gaon Yerushalayim has pointed out, this position and different formulations was shared by Rav Moshe Feinstein, Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, and many others. Okay, and so once you say that, though, you make life very difficult, because now you have to figure out, okay, well, what are the points when we actually think we should try to prolong living? Or let's put it this way: where do you divide the line between making efforts to prolong living, as opposed to efforts which are just prolonging or extending dying? You want to prolong living, you don't want to prolong dying. Okay? And the question then becomes, well, how do you draw that line? Okay, so let's see some of the sources that try to tease this out. Up here? Okay, so there's some rules that are given to what we do in this situation of a gosef. So this is one of the small Masechto Tanot, a minor tractate known as Masechet Smachot, deals with all sorts of issues related to death and mourning. And it tells us as follows: this goses, person who's in the process of dying, is regarded as a living entity in respect of all matters in the world, which means to say that, halachically speaking, until a person's dead, they have a full status of being alive. And therefore, you have to, not only they have halachic consequences for Yerusha, inheritance purposes, for other purposes as well. But here's the critical point in the next Mishnah. Ein ma'amtzin et einei goses. We may not close the eyes of a dying man. And it goes on to say, whoever touches and moves him is a murderer. Shafech damim. Rabbi Meir used to say, can be compared to a lamp which is dripping, or a lamp that's going out, right? It's a flickering, the analogies of a flickering candle here. And if you touch it a little bit, what ends up happening? You extinguish it. Similarly, whoever closes the eyes of a dying man is considered as if he had taken his life. Okay, so this is a very strong statement which says, you know the person is dying. You cannot do anything and touch them in a way that will hasten their death. Now, who are we talking about here? So the Aruch HaShulchan, early 20th century, points out that this is even true. We see that the person is suffering, but and death will be better for him. Right? We acknowledge the fact that death will be better for him. It is forbidden for us to hasten, bring closer, right, his death. He ends with a little bit of a theological statement. The world is the world of the gods, and this is his will. Okay, so this is an important principle, right, which we've seen already, which is to say, A, we recognize the fact that there are times when it's eight lamut, times when people are meant to die, and therefore don't prolong their dying. But you cannot touch the person in a way that's going to hasten their death. Okay? Very important principle. Now, we're laying out principles. Obviously, we have to figure out how this applies in practice. Okay, so here we go back to Rabbi Yehuda Chassid. Okay, Rabbi Yehuda Chassid again, medieval precedent here, tells us as follows: Ein gormin la'adam shelo yamut mehera. One may not prevent a person from dying more quickly. Okay, it's an interesting formulation. Right? What does this mean? Don't slow down them dying. Now, what's the example that we have for slowing down the process of dying? If there was a goses, okay, and the goses goes to the house of a wood chopper, and his soul cannot depart, we remove the wood chopper from there. And what's the scenario? You have a situation where a person is dying, but there's this noise in the background, right? This banging noise from the wood chopper. And the wood chopper, the beat of the wood chopper, the bang, seems to be startling the person. And so the person, you're just prolonging their dying. You're not letting them die. So we say you can remove the wood chopper. Move out the wood chopper. Okay, let's see what other examples he gives. And similarly, one may not place salt on his tongue so that he doesn't die. What does this mean? Not place salt on the tongue. So it seems that there is a belief that if you place salt, this would keep people alive. But here's a scenario where we're saying, don't keep the person alive because you're only prolonging their death. Therefore, don't place this on them. Okay? Now, in the case of the wood chopper, we're actively moving the wood chopper away. We're not touching the person. In the case of the salt, what are we doing here? We are withholding, right? We are foregoing placing the salt so he doesn't die. And then one other example. And if a person goes to saying he cannot die until they move him to a different location, one may not move him from there. Person saying, listen, I can't die in this place. You got to move him. You're not allowed to move him with the fear or her, right? The fear being the very process of moving them will hasten their death. Okay, so this is what Rabbi Yehuda Chassid tells us. And this, I think, follows these general principles that we've seen until now, namely, don't prolong dying, but avoid touching them in a way that will hasten their death. Okay? So let's just see the ruling in the Shulchan Aruch here. And I'll have it in Hebrew and in English, so we'll go to the English. And the Shulchan Aruch says, a goses is considered to be living, we saw that, and anyone who hastens his death is considered a murderer. Okay, this will be very important next week. Again, the issues of active euthanasia, right? And we're going to, of course, have to discuss what exactly does it mean to hasten someone's death, right? Particularly when it comes to issues of medicine and pain medication, right? Like morphine, which might repress breathing, right? But we'll get there in class. Okay? And the Shulchan Aruch establishes don't hasten their death. Now the Ramah acts, and similarly is forbidden to cause a dying person to die quickly. Right? Let's see the Hebrew here for a minute. Right? Don't hasten, right, their death. For example, a person who is a ghost for a long time is unable to separate from the world of the living. It is forbidden to remove the cushion or the pillow from underneath it, as some wish to do. Now we see here, some people would like to do this and like to remove the cushion or the pillow, believing that certain bird feathers are delaying his death. There's this belief that the feathers in the pillow are somehow slowing the death and you can remove it. So we're saying don't remove the pillow, because if you remove the pillow, that will hasten the person's death. However, if there is something which is preventing the soul from departing, for example, if there's a knocking sound near the house, such as a wood chopper, or if there's salt on his tongue, and these are preventing the departure of the soul, it is permitted to remove these from there, since this is not an affirmative act, but merely removing an impediment. Let's see the Hebrew. Right? Removing the wood chopper or removing the salt on his tongue, right, which are considered to be a monea, something that's just an impediment. That you're allowed to do. That is not considered to be an action. That's just considered to be removing an impediment. Okay, so let's see the rules again. Again, don't hasten their death. Don't touch them away. Can't also remove the feathers from the pillow, which is somehow keeping the person alive. Okay? There's also an example that you can't place the keys, the maftechot of the Beit Knesset, under their head. It seems that there's a belief they put the keys of the shul under the person's head. This would hasten their death. Don't do that. But you're allowed to remove an impediment, such as the wood chopper or the salt on the tongue. Okay, it's all clear now, right? It's in Shulchan Aruch. We got the rules. This should be very simple to apply. I'm, of course, being sarcastic. Nikki Katz, go ahead. Let's take a couple questions.
What's the difference between removing the salt and removing the pillows, the feathers? If the feather isn't a impediment to his dying.
Okay, excellent. So let's pull up the screen again one more time. One of the obvious questions that you're going to have here is, well, you've got the feathers. The feathers you can't remove, but the salt you can remove. Now, both of them seem to be cases in which you're actively doing something and taking something away, right? It sounds like you're withdrawing something, one of which is the feather, which somehow is keeping them alive, and one of them is the salt. So your question, I think, is a very good one. Namely, I understand. Now, there's even a different problem that you have to ask before you ask your question, which is an obvious one, Nikki, which is, what's the other question we have to ask?
What's the difference between delaying dying and hastening? The hastening and delaying thing is all not right.
Okay, the hastening, delaying thing is confusing, right? But even in the example that Nikki was referring to, you have a case here of feathers, and you're like, what are the feathers doing? What are they talking about? Right? What is the reality that they're imagining? What is this salt doing? What is the feathers doing? What are the keys from the shoal doing? What are these things?
What about oxygen?
Yeah, okay, so good. So is that Barbara asking, what about oxygen? So is oxygen like a feather in the pillow, or is it like salt on the tongue?
More like salt.
Okay.
I mean, the real question is, how do you understand what the Shulchan Aruch wrote and compare it to what we have at our disposal in modern medicine today?
Excellent. Okay, so so what I'm trying to show you is this follows. Right, you have here, and all the questions are immediate good ones. You seem to have an attempt to lay out some form of principles, which, okay, the principles are, somewhat understandable. Although when you get to like the questions that we saw earlier, like you scream out, that keeps them alive. First of all, what is that? But second of all, like, why is that a problem? Right. So what is that causing? But you understand, like, we shouldn't prolong their suffering. There seems to be concern for suffering. They're going to die anyway. Let them die, but don't do anything. You can let them die, but don't do anything that can hasten their death. So that's sort of understandable, but then it's like, well, where do you draw the line there, right? The examples are going to be hard. And it's precisely when they start giving examples, when you start to ask, right, well, which one is which here? Why are these two different from each other?
He's not calling at people.
Well, you still have certain principles, like you shouldn't touch remove the body. If you remove the pillow or put salt on him, you're disturbing not the body, the person who's in the process of being a gosses. But also a modern question is also, what happens in the face of intractable pain when no painkillers will help?
Great. But before you even get to that point, just bring it back, right? You are correct that there seems to be some form of attempt to make some rules here of not touching. But the question also becomes, is it not touching, or is it not moving the person, right? Remember they said, the person says, I want to be moved. You're not allowed to move them. Are you allowed to touch them? Maybe you're allowed to touch them. Maybe the only problem is moving. There's also a lot of different ramifications as well, right? So what we're going to see coming up here is that the tensions that you're all pointing out were readily acknowledged by the commentaries right away. And
could I ask?
Well, Richard, 1 second.
Yeah.
There's a whole discussion. We're now going to try to start parsing out of what are the key factors that we actually really care about here. Is it the touching and the moving? Is it the hastening? Is it the prolonging? Right? What are these factors? Richard, go ahead.
It doesn't seem to me that there's any hope of extracting what we would view as the underlying rationale from a consideration of the physical processes. What we need to know is what were the people of the time thinking was happening. I mean, we would say maybe it's superstition, but they viewed it as part of medical knowledge. And the question is, do we have any information about what people thought the procedures or the actions were doing at the time? That's the only
Yeah.
way of extracting principles.
Well, correct. I mean, so today I would definitely say that people are very interested in exploring this in terms of understanding what did they think then? What did Rabbi Yehuda Chassid think? What did they think in Germany, right, in the 12th century? Right? What was actually accomplished there? And there are some attempts to try to understand this, although some of the issues, with all the history we have here, we're still trying to figure out.
Yeah.
So it does complicate things. And the other thing it complicates, I see your hand, Nikki, 1 second, is also that, let's say we think that's significant. But suppose, as we're going to see in the 16th or 17th century, they understood them to be saying something else, and they established the principles in a different way. So what becomes the precedent for us? Nikki?
Yeah, what bothers me is how do you remove salt from the tongue without touching him?
So it would seem very good. It would seem that touching might not be a problem. It may only be a problem of moving.
Right.
And then as we're going to see, is it Hida Silverstein? Hida?
Go ahead. My name is Heather.
Yeah,
Yeah, my
sorry.
question is, if somebody has bed sores, you're going to move them even if they're dying. And how does this really apply? Is this so important, knowing what was, if it doesn't really apply today with our scientific knowledge?
Yeah, so it's correct, meaning all these. So here's where I'm trying to show you is that we are in an interesting situation where Halakha typically tries to operate based on precedents. That's in general a process of how we continue and work with a Masorah of law as we work on a system of precedents. And here we've got precedents. Okay, well, we're going to get to the issues of brain death and determining death. We're going to see the amount of precedents we have there aren't so great. I mean, this is a general issue, right? When you come to a lot of questions of particularly medicine and science, in vitro fertilization, who's the mom? Right? Those types of questions, right? What are the sources we have? We have Midrashim about Rachel and Leah, and they switch this and that. Like, these are our precedents. I mean, I was just listening to a shiur by a friend of mine about AI, issues of AI. So he wants to talk about how to deal with AI and consciousness. And he's like, well, let's think about what Jews had to say about a golem. I'm thinking to myself, this is our precedent, right? So this is this is part of the very, very difficult part of trying to work this out because of not having clear-cut precedents to help guide us here.
And I think also the idea of, for example, someone touching someone when they're when you might not know that they're in the process of dying, but if someone, for example, is in position on the back, and if they're regurgitating and you want to present aspiration, you might want to turn on their side. So is that prolonging their life, or is it caring?
Great. All the right questions here, right? And we're going to have to sometimes prioritize. Right? Well, you got to deal with the suffering right now. As someone else was asking earlier on as well. Okay, so I think we now have clear on the one hand that there are some sources here that seem to be trying to lay out principles. Well, exactly what these principles are and how to apply them, particularly when we think about our medicine and our technology today, is not so clear. Okay, so I want to show you a few of the attempts to try to deal with some of these issues. So someone had pointed out beforehand and said, wait a minute, if you can't remove the feather pillow, how come you can remove the salt? So actually, I think, Nikki, this is your question. And the Taz, one of the early commentators of the Shulchan Aruch, says you can't move the salt. You can't take off the salt. You just can't. Right? As he says, there's an internal contradiction here, and we don't allow that. But, and this is very quite significant for us, many of the other commentators say, no, no, no. The difference between moving the pillow, feathers, and moving the salt is that when you remove the pillow, the person's going to move. You're shaking the person. But the salt is external enough that it's really like a outside impediment. It's like external to the person. It's much more akin to the wood chopper who's separate from us. Okay, so that's one way of dealing with these tensions, but again, the tensions still exist. Okay, here's another version of trying to deal with some of these issues. This is written by someone who dies in 1733, Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch of Vilna, excuse me, right? It's a sefer called Beit Lechem Yehuda. His name wasn't Yehuda, but his sponsor, his Kvir, who paid for him, and paid for his work, was named Yehuda. So that's why the book is called Yehuda. And he has a very interesting statement. He says, how come you can take off the salt? And he says as follows: why they put the salt on in the first place? To keep the person alive. Are you supposed to put salt on in the first place to prolong a person? Only if you're doing it to prolong living. But once we saw that now you're just keeping the salt on to prolong dying, then you can remove the salt. Now, this is interesting. Forget about understanding what exactly the salt is doing. This is interesting because what he's saying is when you put something on initially, you thought it was going to help you to keep the person alive. It turns out it's not going to keep them alive. Certainly not going to recover. It's just prolonging the dying. Well, if that's the case, we can now remove it. This is very different than what the Shach said. The Shach said the salt is external, not really touching the person. You're touching them, you're not moving them. The Beit Lechem Yehuda is saying something different. The key factor for us is not how much we're touching the person or moving the person. The key distinction goes back to, is this item prolonging death or prolonging life? And if we now know that's going to be just prolonging dying, we can remove it. Let's see one more example. 1 second. One more example here. And this is a key example, okay? Again, these are all figures trying to deal with, shall I see your hand, give me 1 second, trying to deal with this tension. And this is a critical source of the Shiltei Giborim, who lives in Spain and Italy, right, in dies in 1557. He's influencing actually the Ramah. And he tells us the follows. Listen, in my time, people would remove the feathers in the pillow. And even Rav Natan of Igra said this was mutter, meaning some people felt remove the pillow, remove the feathers is allowed. And he says, but you know, I went and I found the Sefer Hasidim, and here's what he says: it's forbidden to do something that will cause him to die sooner. And here he tries to lay out some principles. If there's something that prevents his soul from departing, there's no prohibition to remove it. For in doing so, one is not snuffing out the candle or doing an act at all. Now, this is an interesting distinction. At first, he says it's not snuffing out the candle, but here seems to be the key point. You're not even doing an act at all. There's ain ma'aseh. But if you place something on the gossetz or move him, this is a problem because you're doing an action. And here, Shiltei Giborim seems to be introducing a different distinction. This becomes hugely influential because it probably influences the Ramah as well, in which he says the distinction is whether you're doing an act or not doing an act. Is there a ma'aseh or is there no ma'aseh? We sometimes refer to this in halachic literature. Is it there a shev ve'al taseh? You're doing an act of omission, or is it a kum vaseh, an act of commission? And the Shiltei Giborim is making a different distinction than we saw before. It's not about touching versus moving. It's not about, right? Because when you touch or move, in both cases, you're doing something. And it's not necessarily about whether it's hastening death or prolonging death or prolonging living. The distinction is there an action here? Is there an action? If there's no action, that's allowed. It's an act of omission, that's allowed. If there is a kumbase action, an act of commission, that is not allowed. Okay, has this cleared everything up?
No.
Shelley, you have a question?
Yes,
Go with that.
the point that you did before, right before this, about is it prolonging life or is it prolonging death? That seems to be so modern. Do you put in a breathing tube? Do you put in a feeding tube? Somebody comes in with an accident or something, and something may, if they're going to recover, it will definitely save them. But if they're not going to recover, then they're on this thing forever and you can't take it off. It would seem from that you could take it off. But I don't believe, can you?
Well, let's think that through for a minute. Right? A lot of this depends on which of the guiding, which of these interpretations you understand to establish clear precedent. If you think the distinction is about acts or not acts, acts of commission or acts of omission, and so let's say removing a ventilator, that would seem to be you're doing something here, right? It's like akin to taking out the pillow from underneath, which we saw. He says, some people did this, but I think this is wrong. Okay? If you think the distinction, though, is a matter of touching versus moving, well, I don't know. Can you remove a tube from someone without really moving them? Maybe. Can you remove an IV? Maybe. Yeah, maybe you could argue, right? Right? But if the question is a matter of prolonging living versus prolonging dying, meaning the thing is going to actually help someone or is it not going to help someone, that opens the door for a lot of different types of possibilities. So what I'm trying to show now is that the precedents created in medieval times and codified by the Shulchan Aruch lend themselves to different types of interpretations, which themselves are being guided by different types of distinctions. And part of the debate becomes now in the modern era, when we try to think about some of the technology that we have, right, is which of these distinctions are going to govern the way we think about these issues. So let me show you a position related exactly to the point that was being made beforehand. Okay, and this is a tshuva written by Rabbi Chaim David.
I'm sorry, I just muted all the participants. There were a bunch of people unmuted. So you need to, Rabbi Brody, you need to unmute yourself again. I know that there's some hands up. I think we need to unmute only as we are asking a question because there's some
I see a bunch of hands and I'm anticipating that I'm going to answer some of the questions.
Yes, yeah, I apologize. There's just some background noise. So I'm trying to mitigate that by muting people.
Okay. All good. Okay, so here's Rabbi Chaim David Halevi. Rabbi Chaim David Halevi was the starting chief rabbi of Tel Aviv. Could have been the chief rabbi of Israel. He loses the vote, but certainly a very distinguished per se. And he is asked to address this issue of removing the ventilator. Removing the ventilator, I mean, there are other things that could be removed, of course, that are significant in modern healthcare, but the ventilator is certainly the one that gets the most attention because it brings about, it's the most, I guess, because it's the most aggressive form of intervention that is so critical in a lot of different ways. And it's utilized in many, many different scenarios. And when a person becomes vent dependent, right, they become dependent on the ventilator. So removing it, extubation, right, can certainly cause them to die. We're going to see a little bit of nuance about this coming up momentarily, but that's why this became such a big issue. And Chaim David Halevi is asked about this question. If I'm not mistaken, what I'm showing you is a lecture they gave at one of the hospitals in Israel. I don't remember now which one. I think it was Hadassah, I'm not sure. And he says as follows. He talks about the salt. And he says this salt thing is a big deal for me. And he says, listen, the salt was placed there to lengthen the person's life out of hope of finding some cure for his illness. But now that we see that he is a goseh, and the grain of salt is prolonging the suffering in his state of gesisah, one may remove it. From this, it's clear. Remember that Beit Lechem Yehuda? Remember the Beit Lechem Yehuda had said, right, if the salt shouldn't have been there in the first place, then you can remove it. So Chaim David Levi says, when is it that the salt couldn't have been there in the first place? The salt was put there because you thought it was going to help prolong living. Now it turns out it's just prolonging a person's dying. What's the equivalent of that in our times? He says, a respirator. For when this patient was brought to the hospital in a serious condition, they immediately attached him to the respirator and they kept him alive artificially in order to try to treat him and heal him. Right? That's what we use ventilators for. They're meant to be a bridge, right? To help a person breathe, but they're meant to be a bridge to get somewhere. But sometimes the ventilator becomes a bridge to nowhere, so to speak. But when the doctors realize that there's no treatment for his condition, it's obvious that one may remove the patient from the machine to which he's been attached. Look what it says, it's obvious. And we can further reason based on a Kavachomer, where the patients we've been dealing with in the earlier sources are capable of breathing on their own. But even so, when we see that the souls want to depart, but the soul is preventing it, one may remove it. How much more so in our times that the patient is attached to the respirator is incapable of autonomous respiration, such that his whole life comes only from this machine. If his whole life comes only from this machine, this is an impediment to death. And by removing the ventilator, what are you doing? You're just removing the impediment. It's like the wood chopper or the salt on the tongue. This was the position of Chaim David HaLevi. And I wouldn't say he's the only one who says this, but he's one of the only one who says this. Okay? And the question is why? Now, one of the reasons why is, let's understand though, according to Chaim David HaLevi, are you doing an act, when you remove that ventilator? Sure, there's no other way of doing it, right? So when you extubate, you are doing an action. That's not being passive. So according to some of the versions that we saw, that's a problem. But he's working with a very specific type of understanding we saw in the Beit Lechem Yehuda, which says that no, if it's something was put on originally, now you're putting it off because it's become an impediment. There's something very interesting and sophisticated in my mind of what Chaim David HaLevi is saying. He's saying we need to understand what modern technology, medical technology does. And sometimes the medical technology can start off by being something that prolongs living. But in the course of the treatment, we come to understand that it's not going to prolong living. It's just prolonging dying. It becomes an impediment to death. How do we know? The answer is there's only one way to find out. So you put the person on the ventilator, they come into the hospital, there's a car crash, whatever it is. You hope it's a bridge to somewhere. Turns out it's a bridge to nowhere. And his point is that doesn't mean you can't then remove it. That's precisely what the salt was. Right? Now, I see a few hands. Let me just show the contrary position for one moment. The contrary position, which is certainly the dominant position, meaning much more prominent, certainly in Orthodox circles, says something different. And this is a picture of Moshe Feinstein, dies in 1986. Great posek, really adored America, widely influential. But this psak is shared by many, many others as well. Okay, where Rav Moshe, by the way, Rav Moshe's Chuvot in Hebrew on medical ethics and thinking end of life, were translated by Selnar of Moshe David Tendler, and that book is now available on Sfaria. So anyone who wants, Sfaria, I never know how to pronounce it. So anyone who wants to learn from it is welcome to do so. And Rav Moshe says as follows: if no sign of life is apparent to the eye, and the patient is absolutely unresponsive, such as the print pic, he's in a coma. Person in a coma, but is still forbidden to remove the respirator for fear they may be alive, and this will kill him. What is Rav Moshe concerned about? Precisely what we saw earlier in the Shiltei Giborim. This notion of saying you're doing an act, and by doing an action, kum v'aseh, you are going to snuff out the candle. And so therefore Moshe says it is prohibited to remove the ventilator because that will kill the person. Now, if he goes on to say, and we'll come back to understand the significance momentarily, if the ventilator has to be serviced, or there's some form of mucus or something else, you have to remove it or clear it out, or in the old days when oxygen tanks were used. This isn't so relevant in today's hospitals because ventilators are hooked up into a main line in the wall. You can see it, right? But if that would be the case where the oxygen tank ran out, and you can see, okay, what's going on here, then you're not required to reattach the ventilator to the oxygen tank, because that is an act of omission. But to actually pull out, to extubate the ventilator is a problem. He's getting this from the Shiltei Gibor, who said very clearly, to do an act of commission that snuffs out the candle, you've got a problem. And this is where the vast majority, certainly in the Orthodox world of posting, understood this to be, because the Shiltei Giborim greatly influenced the Ramah, and this is why it's become understood, we're going to complicate that momentarily, that it's prohibited to remove the ventilator. Okay, let's take a few questions. Harold Pearl, and then
He's muted.
nice. He's trying to unmute. All right, Harold, we're going to come back to you. We'll come back to you when you get on. I can see when you get unmuted. Nikki, go ahead.
I think I got it. Okay. Hey, can you hear me now?
Yeah, go ahead, Harold, and then Nikki.
All right, this is Alex. Actually, 2 points. One, the argument of having a MISA or not having MISA, being able to remove salt from the lips is totally inconsistent with differentiating between a MISA and not having a MISA, because clearly that is a MISA. You can't remove salt from the lips and say there's no MISA there.
I agree with you. I agree with you, and that's why, to a certain extent, you have to pick which of the examples. That's what the later Achronim try to do. Which of the examples they really think are governing the rules here, because the medieval precedents create a lot of confusion.
And one other interesting point is that being able to remove somebody from the ventilator using this argument as opposed to brain death, right? So when you use brain death, you're saying the patient is already dead and there's
Correct.
no reason for the patient to be on the ventilator. Here,
Yes.
you're acknowledging that the patient is not really dead yet, but you're inhibiting the patient from allowing the patient to die, and therefore
Right.
you should be able to remove it. So it's a very
Correct.
little subtle difference there.
There's no difference. We'll cover that in a couple of weeks. Nikki and then Richard.
Yeah. The problem with not being able to remove the intubation is that you then give the physician that he's going to hesitate to put it in, and therefore you're not prolonging life, which is you're supposed to do. So this is a two-edged sword.
Yeah.
So the fact that you can take it out would encourage physicians to put in questionable cases.
So I think that you're raising a very, very important point. In the halakhic world, it's been promoted most recently by Rabbi Mordechai Willig of Yeshiva University. He was pointing out the following, but you're picking up right away. When you tell people once you intubate, you can't extubate, you're afraid they're gonna die right away. That's gonna make people say, "Oh, I don't want to intubate in the first place." Right now, sometimes, and this is a general rule, Rav Weiss stresses this a lot as well. Don't intubate if you never think you're gonna be able to extubate. That's a general rule. What's the point? Right, that's just prolonging. Right, but of course, we live in a world of medicine, which is a world of uncertainty, and so you have this situation where some might say, well, maybe it pays to intubate. And the family, let alone the physician, the family might be saying, I don't want to intubate if I'm never going to be able to extubate. Okay? Which is why it's important to keep in mind some other positions. And I want to show you this right now since it was raised. This was a position that was taken by Zalman Nachemia Goldberg. I'm sorry I don't have it in English. Well, he's one of the great, very fascinating poskim, passed away several years ago in Yerushalayim, very contemporary. And he points out and says, listen, he asked the same question, what was going on with the salt? And he says the salt is a case where you can remove it because the person won't die right away. And his point is as follows. The same thing he thinks is true with the wood chopper and others. And his point then is to say as follows. When is there a problem of removing something, doing something active? Is only if they'll die immediately. But if there will be a delay, right, what we might call, it's not grumma in this respect, but conception, there's a some of analogy here. If you're removing the impediment, so that way the process can keep on going and they'll die afterwards, that's not a problem. Now, this is very interesting because suppose you can extubate a patient, right, remove the ventilator, and they may not live, but they're not going to die right away. This happens all the time, in fact. And so I'm actually working deeply on this issue at length because Rav Zalman Nechemia Goldberg is not the only one who felt this way, who felt that you could remove a ventilator as long as the person wouldn't die right away. Now, the question is, what does it mean not die right away? Is it 2 days? That's one position that's brought down the Sefer Nishma Havam. It's 2 days. Most people who are dependent on the ventilator will die within 2 days after you remove it. Maybe it's 2 hours. 2 hours, that's a different story. Maybe it's even 30 minutes. Okay? And then the question becomes, as physicians, what indicators, what variables might give you a strong, hint or greater probability of the fact that extubation won't lead to immediate death. So this is something I'm working on at great lengths right now. There's some very interesting research that we're trying to push on this issue because it's an area of interest to me. Now, again, many poskim still felt this is a problem. When he wrote his article, he was viciously criticized by other poskim. And he held his ground, and the other poskim is still interested in this. But many people feel that the problem is simply you're doing an act of commission. You're doing an act of commission, that's going to be a problem. Right? But I'm very sympathetic to the issue that you're raising, Nikki, about this issue. We don't want to discourage people from intubating in the first place because they're so afraid that their family member will be stuck.
You don't know how many cases, I'm a physician, I can tell you, I can't tell you how many cases you thought it's for nothing and then they recover. So
absolutely. Yeah, I'd actually like to hear about that another time. That's very interesting to me. Richard Shore.
Yes. So there's by now a minor point, but the Beit Lechem Yehuda, I couldn't read it, but when you said it, it sounded to me as it might have meant that at the time the salt was placed there, it was put there b'isur. That is, it not that he was mistaken in the in the whether it was living, prolonging life or death, but simply he had violated the rule.
Yeah.
And in which case it's a totally, I couldn't, as I said, I couldn't actually read what he wrote, but from what you said, it seemed to me that was a plausible reading.
It is definitely a plausible reading, and that is one of the reasons why people rejected Reb Chaim David HaLevi.
Yeah,
they're saying you're imposing this idea that it was put on the head there, right? It was done correctly, but now it's become a problem.
Yeah.
But Rabbi Chaim David is a very interesting argument. He says, why would it have been done? Why would I put someone put on there in the first place if they didn't think it was a chance? I don't know. Again, it relates to the same issue we're getting at. Is as much as we get greater clarity, we still have the precedents are sometimes hard to figure out. And this just relates to how different medicine is today than it once was. Jolene.
When we're talking about ventilators, I just want to clarify or add in about the number of people who have spinal cord injuries and rely on ventilators to live. They would die within a few hours if they weren't on ventilators.
Yeah.
And I just want to, where we're seeming to be focusing on ventilators, and there are a fair number of people who do believe that these people should not have ventilators to begin with, because their quality of life is not what how they would want to live.
Yeah, so we're going to touch upon this a bit next week as well. There's no doubt. I mean, ventilators, also, it's important what term you use. You use the term ventilator, you use the term respirator, you use the term life support. So the nomenclature is important. And there's no doubt, I mean, ventilators are an amazing phenomenon. I mean, now we also have ECMO machines. I mean, that's unbelievable. Right? And ECMO machines are tremendous. And maybe we'll talk about it more next week, or actually 2 weeks, 3 weeks. But, this is tremendous technology, which many times can keep people alive and meaningfully living. And the cases where we're talking about here, where people want to remove, or at least classically wanted to remove a ventilator, was where the cases where the fear was you're keeping people breathing, their heart beating, but they are not meaningfully living. And that happens all the time. Right? And they can go to many different long-term facilities where people their bodies are kept going for a very long time, and you sort of ask yourself, why? I saw another hand.
I
here.
had yeah.
Go.
I just want to say something that this is Hedda Silverstein speaking again.
ahead.
I feel that while you are healthy, you should put in a DAR, I believe it's called, and make the decisions for yourself. When you would want to be on whatever.
Excellent point. DNR is referring to about do not resuscitate, or in this case would be DNI, do not intubate. But let's just keep in mind, according to some of the positions, certainly Rabbi Jacobovitz felt this way, that option of signing a DNI doesn't exist. You have to be of the view, which I think is very well founded, right, in the sources, and that's why I was starting with the first Sefer Hasidim and the Rabbi Kanievsky's position, which is that sometimes people, right, should be, there's no point in keeping people alive, keeping people breathing, right? And then you open the option for DNIs. But, and this is the point that Dr. Katz was raising earlier, be careful about DNIs, because there are many times people say, I think it's a low probability that intubation is going to help. Then all of a sudden, it worked. And so you're in a world of uncertainty. A world of uncertainty. Medicine is a lot of uncertainty.
Well, I think in New York State, if they put you on a ventilator or whatever the instruments are now, they can't take you off.
They can, but we'll talk about that next week. They can actually. We'll talk about it next week. Now, I don't want to lose something important that Moshe Feinstein said.
Thank you.
Okay. No, absolutely. And I look forward to continuing this part of the conversation next week. But I want to make sure you saw something in Rav Moshe's statement. Rav Moshe Feinstein, remember, it said that when it comes to the oxygen, you can't pull out the ventilator, but if the oxygen tanks run out, you don't have to re-intubate. And this isn't so relevant for our contemporary ventilators, but the principle is very relevant, which says that when things run out, when you have cyclical treatments, in between treatments, you can forego that treatment. I want to show you an important list of things which, according to that principle, could be applied. This is all still in the category of withholding, of shev al taseh, of not doing actions, right? Letting nature take its course and allowing the person to die, rather than doing something which actively causes or hastens their death. This is the dominant position, certainly in Orthodox discourse. I also say sometimes call this an A and B, allow natural death. So can a person say, there's no point in me doing this surgery? The chances of it helping are low, the chances of being harmful are great, I'm not doing a surgery. Or radiation, or going on pressors. Or if you're in between dialysis treatments, or chemo treatments, or many other issues, you might be able to say from this precedent that even if you had been giving it this treatment until now, but once it runs out, so to speak, in between cycles of dialysis, or IV bags, or many other types of examples, then you don't have to keep it, recontinue it. That would be Sheva al Taseh. That opens the door for many, many things. And in fact, Israel's terminally ill law, which was enacted in 2006, which is more or less, it's a fascinating case of a law that more or less follows not only Halakha, but the specific psakim of Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, who's talked about more in the future, right? Puts this into the law that allows and says cyclical interventions, right, which are or intermittent or cyclical, whatever you want to call it, in between sessions, you can stop and say, I'm not going to do this anymore. And so that is quite significant, right? Because those examples of chemo and dialysis and others, radiation, right, are quite significant. But it still doesn't help with the intubation because the intubation is continuous. It's not cyclical, at least in our modern versions of it. Okay, so I see there are a few more questions, but I just want to sum up where we're at, and then I'll stay on, of course, for the continued conversation. Right? And the point which I wanted to see today is the precedents that we have were well-established precedents, but they just aren't so clear. And that leads to competing interpretations of what are the dominating principles. Is it a matter of prolonging life, living versus prolonging dying, which everyone agrees. And it's important to see that. No one wants to prolong dying. Just the question becomes, what are you going to do about it? What are you allowed to do about it? And that hinges very greatly on which of these interpretations you utilize. Okay, I see Joan Sachs you have, and then I see Nikki's got her hand up, and then your other hand. So Joan, take it away. Rabbi Joan. You're muted still.
I was wondering if we're going to get copies of the texts that we're studying.
Yeah, I keep on trying to work out how to do that properly, but I can get that.
Okay, for those of us who are chaplains, it would definitely be.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. And the other question I had too, actually, one is we talked about touching and whether or not you can touch, but family members like to sit and hold someone's hand. And so that's a question. Does that accelerate? Does that keep someone living? Does that comfort someone who's dying? And it comforts, obviously, the person who's holding the hand usually. The other is, in terms of taking off a ventilator, can they wait until if family members are en route until the family members arrive or not?
So the first point is, I think in practice, we do allow people to touch. It's moving. That's more of a concern. And even they're moving, questions what's really moving. And so, and I think for all the reasons that you intuitively say, both for the family members and for the patient, it can be very meaningful. It just triggered a whole. I remember when my father passed away. My father passed away, and he had scleroderma, so it meant that his skin was very rough. And it seems that as he was dying, there's a release, and so there's a blood flow came back to his extremities. All of a sudden, his hands, which used to be very rough, got much softer. And that was a tremendously important experience for me, for my mom. So, yeah, I think touching is quite important there. Nikki, go ahead.
My understanding.
But the waiting until the family gets there.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, so that's certainly a fact. I mean, it's interesting how long you wait, because you have to keep in mind there's this balance. You're waiting, let's say you would allow removing the ventilator, right? But you want to have the family around. So are you prolonging someone's dying in order to let that person, and a lot of that relates to the question of what type of pain control we think the person is receiving. Yeah. And pain control is a hugely important value. I'm not sure we're going to be able to discuss it so much in this course this time, but it's a real halachic value. Pain, by the way, also kills, meaning on a physiological level, and it actually causes harm as well. So you really have to treat the pain, so to speak. And at some point, if we're gonna have to sometimes make decisions. which is one of the important things that people have to think about alertness versus pain control. So, but on the assumption that you think that the pain is under control, I think it's appropriate to allow as a kavod for everyone involved.
Okay.
But again, within reason, right? If someone's, on a desert island in the Indian Ocean, listen, we laugh, but these cases
No,
happen.
no, it's why I asked the question, because there
Yeah, I
are the
got it. I got it.
variables.
You're a chaplain, you see this. Dr. Katz.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
I've noticed, I heard that there was a system whereby you could take the ventilator, put it on a battery and let the battery die.
So
Eventually.
The problem with some of those contraptions is how do you test them? And so this came up on an ethical level, right? How are you going to test these things? This came up not so much with the battery, but the Israeli law was supposed to have that all people put on intubators, we put on what we call a Shabbos clock. Okay? And this was actually the idea that was already suggested 20-something years, 20, 30, already 40 years ago, which by the Tzitz of Ezra Belezer Waldenberg, who said the problem with removing a ventilator is it's going to cause immediate death. Right? His issue is you don't want humans being involved in an active act that leads to death. But if they're putting them on the ventilator with the hope that this will be a bridge to somewhere, turns out that's not the case. So let it stop. Right? What we call a Shabbos clock. And this was put into Israeli law. As you can understand, many people around the world, doctors, ethicists, whatever, laugh at it because they're like, what is the ethical significance of it? The answer was that this was a deeply significant, certainly with Jewish cultural sensitivities, we didn't want Jews to be actively involved in doing something that would cause a death. So this was the grand idea that was put into Israeli law, but unfortunately it has not been implemented in practice. I know well the doctor who was in charge of trying to put this into practice, and for various reasons, it didn't happen. And there's an attempt now again to try to restart that process. But you understand that in the state of Israel, it is forbidden by law to remove someone from the ventilator. And people are always like shocked by this, like, but that is the law in the state of Israel. There are other ways people die, right? And there are other ways that this can happen, but that is the law in the state of Israel. And that's a big issue, which is pretty remarkable because there is this position of some poskim like Chaim David, who was a chief rabbi of Tel Aviv, right? And but that just shows you how carefully that law was crafted. I think it's very regrettable that the Shabbos clock model hasn't been implemented, and we'll see if something happens. I don't know of the battery, but I know of the Shabbos clock. I didn't give it battery.
Yeah.
In principle, it's the same idea.
Yeah.
Let's see if
I have a question.
Marcy.
Yeah,
Marcy.
if you're talking about a Shabbos clock, so does that mean you're going to schedule
So what
the
you
date that or
yeah,
the time that the person
right.
comes?
So what you would do is you'd put it on the timer and you just keep it going, right? You would have to say a 48-hour timer. And if you think the ventilator still makes sense, you would keep it going. And if you think that it doesn't make sense, then you switch it to the timer mode, right? Or keep on the timer mode. There's all sorts of variations of how to do this. Of course, you might be saying, wow, that feels like you're like scheduling someone's death. Like, isn't that weird? But
That's to me, if you decide you can take them off the ventilator, then take them off the ventilator. It sounds like a game.
So I will tell you that some people see this as a bit of a game. And, it's like the same way some people see, timers turning on lights or air conditionings and shoals and all sorts of automation that we use today as a game to get around the rules of Shabbat. And other people see it as a brilliant way of using technology to try to balance certain values.
Rabbi Brody?
And so that's, I think, where part of the tension is.
May I say something?
Of course.
I think, look, everybody, I think has a hard time asking questions on a general level. So I'll try to make this general, but obviously we all have our own personal experiences to draw on. My question is, when it comes to all of these things that we're discussing now, Rabbi Sachs was alluding to some of these things in terms of, the family needing to touch. You actually alluded to it yourself in terms of your experience with your father, and also what Marcy's saying now about, the idea of these timers. I wonder if you could speak, and maybe you will in another class, so maybe now's not the time, to the idea of how do we determine when we're making these choices for the patient versus when the caregivers, the family, are making choices, even when it comes to like pain medication and management. People that are watching, these things happen to a loved one, are also in pain for their loved one. Yeah. And I've seen it happen where, somebody says, but they're in pain, but really it's the person that's in pain watching this unfold, and maybe they're making those decisions based on their, I hope what I'm trying to ask is coming across.
No, absolutely. Meaning this is a very deep and difficult issue of surrogate decision making. Well, I'll take a step back. I'm a big promoter of the idea that you should share your values. You can't always know all the choices that are gonna have to be made in your healthcare journey. Okay, but I think you can share values that you want your family members to know. If you can't make the decision for yourself, these are the ideas I'd want to guide. But then again, you can always predict, right? You know what would happen. So we have this notion of surrogate decision makers. The person can appoint a proxy, for example. And there's this question always is, well, what should the values be that drive the person? Should it be that the surrogate tries to do exactly what they think the patient would have wanted, or should the surrogate do what they think is in the patient's best interests? Should they follow their own conscience? Right? There's a little bit of a debate about this, and then it always gets in the question of, well, how do they decide, and what's driving their decision making? The same, by the way, could be asked about hospitals and doctors, right? Particularly hospitals when they have to think about costs, right? Not a small issue. Or medical systems. And what values are driving. And I think there's no, when it comes to family members serving as surrogates, which is where we're going with this, particularly Shira, I think that it is very, very difficult for family members to do this, which is why it's very beneficial when there are multiple family members who've talked this over beforehand with the patient, who've built up a certain sense of camaraderie and being able to converse about this, and can sort of balance each other out in terms of making these decisions. Fatigue is a huge issue for caretakers. And so there's always this fear that, maybe they'll make a decision because they're worn out. That's always a fear, but I tend to think, and I think that experience shows a lot, is that caregivers, usually loving caregivers, let's put it this way, loving caregivers should feel at peace knowing that their conscience is probably guiding. Loving caregivers usually, I think, do a very good job in a world of uncertainty where it's not always clear. I mean, it's just not always clear. And this came up last week also. Someone asked about their loved one who has dementia, advanced dementia. They're really not sure what they would want. Hard to know. That's why advanced conversations are very beneficial. But I think loving caregivers usually do a pretty good job at this. There are always exceptions to it, but I think people should know and trust some of their loving instincts in some sense. But it's really different. It's really different.
Thank you.
Okay. I will stay on if there's anyone else I didn't see, but otherwise, this is heavy topics. but hopefully meaningful conversation as well. And I look forward to seeing you next week.
Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Thank you very, very much. It's wonderful.
Pleasure.
You have a brother, I suspect, in Englewood, New Jersey.
I do.
You look just like him. I got when you got on, I said, "Oh my God, it must be a brother."
Yeah, that's my brother. That's my brother. Yeah,
Yeah.
he's my oldest brother. Indeed.
You sound like him, and you you look like him.
And so I never saw the resemblance. And then, you never see your own family members. And then last year, 2 years ago, he took a selfie. My brother's a big selfie guy. I hate selfies. We like taking selfies. I looked at the picture. I'm like, we do look alike.
Like twins.
Get that. Get that. I see my Aunt Daya's like, well, he looks more like the other brother. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Rabbi Brody, I just had to raise one thing. I've dealt with situations where family members are fighting, actually. And what I've always suggested to patients that I've worked with is that they make an advance directive. Mine's pretty detailed. My kids know
So
the
advance directives have borne out to be effective, particularly in cases where people have a good idea of where their healthcare journey is going. And in those cases, it's particularly helpful. If it's too advanced, a lot of times it's like they didn't know what they're signing and people change their mind. But it's not enough. Meaning advanced directives are sufficient, are helpful, but it's also important to share with those different family members you think are going to be around what your wishes are, to talk that through.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Because otherwise, I had this case like 2 months ago, whoever it was, where there was a mother who had appointed her daughter to be the proxy for good reason. For a lot of reasons. Well, I was hearing the story from the daughter, so but I understood why. She was involved in the healthcare profession, a number of different reasons. They were more similar religiously, whatever it might be. But she had never shared with other siblings that A, she had appointed this daughter as the proxy, and B, what her wishes were. So when the moment of truth came, the daughter felt very much responsible as the proxy and the one who had actually talked to their mother about it to implement the decision. And the other siblings were like, where's this coming from? And it caused a lot of issues. So I'm changing details here, by the way, genders and other things.
Of course, that's fine.
The Jewish world is very, very small. So, so advanced directives are helpful. I just finished writing a new one. We're going to be releasing it in Matai, and I'm a big believer in it, but it's got to be part of a broader process as well.
Well, when I've talked to patients, I've always said you can change it or throw it away at the last minute. It's, entirely up to you. It's always in your control while you're conscious anyway.
Yeah, while you're conscious, but you don't always know when.
Exactly. And I'm a patient as well, by the way. So I've dealt with some of these.
Right. Harold.
Yeah, I just wanted to add the point that in pediatrics, and especially in newborns, the question of who speaks for the patient is always the question, okay? Because the patient can never speak for themselves. So the standard that we use is what is the best interest of the child? But even that sometimes, rarely, but the famous ones come to conflict. For example, the baby doe laws that came out in the 80s was a result of a very educated set of parents who were both psychiatrists who had a baby with trisomy 21, Down syndrome. And their view was, I would not want to live a life like that. Therefore, my baby would not want to live like that. But that was not correct, because the baby has a right to live as they want and not necessarily the expectations of the parents. But that's a constant issue for pediatrics and newborns, and sometimes becomes a conflict between 99% or 98% is the parents, sometimes it's the physicians, and sometimes it winds up going to the court, and the court hates that because they have no idea what to decide with that. So they want send it to the bioethics committee and decide before you get to court.
Yeah, oh, that's a great example. It's a great point. This came up in England, Manchester, last year was, or last year, maybe 2 years ago already, where a very frum family had a terminally ill baby born. And, but here, the family was insisting to continue to keep him on life support, and even though there's no known cure. And they even arranged to have the baby flown to either Israel or New York. And Chuck Schumer got involved, all right? And the British courts determined that the hospital is the one that has the best view of the best interest of the patient. And the British courts refused to allow the baby to be taken out of England, and the baby was taken off life support and died because they determined. So who determines best interest? It's very, very complicated, and let's come with it next week as well. Yeah, it's a great example. Great example. Okay, all right. See everyone next
Thank
week.
you so much, Rabbi Brody. Really,
Thank you. Oh, sorry, Ben Mella.
Thank
All
you.
right, Rabbi, when it comes to the DNR, one of the things that I didn't know is when your loved one goes into the hospital, you can make a decision about the DNR at that point. And if the situation changes, you should actively change it, because just because you came in with one decision doesn't mean that you can't adopt to it. And most people are just too caught up in the situation to realize that.
Yeah, you gotta think carefully about signing DNRs, and correct. That's an important thing to know as well. That can be altered. So don't sign it unless you really want that. That's a thank you for pointing it out. Okay, see everyone next week.
thank you.
Thank you. Kodesh Tov, everyone.
Thank you, Sheila.
Yeah,
Also.
Take good care, everybody.
thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.